Blazor today. Real quick about myself, Jeff Maxwell, went to school at Oklahoma State eons ago, computer science major. Been programming or an architect for 25 plus years. Currently doing secure development and working as a security architect at Sonic. Blazor runs on WebAssembly, and if you haven't heard what a WebAssembly is, it runs in the confines of a browser. It's kind of how JavaScript works. Eons ago, we used to run Flash and Silverlight. Thankfully, those have kind of been killed off. I kind of like Silverlight, I kind of like Flash in the day, but those have been killed off by Apple when they said it'll never run on the iPad. Flash or Silverlight will never run on the iPad, and they kind of seriously declined. So everybody shifted to JavaScript, right? And I don't know about you, but I hated JavaScript, especially jQuery. My code was really unorganized. It may just be I'm a bad developer probably, but my code was really unorganized and very large and just kind of seemed like a mess. So what's happened over time is WebAssembly, they allow you to do what's called WASM, create an assembly that goes into the browser and runs in the client of the browser. Started out with C and C++, but pretty much every language has now kind of jumped on board. Go, Rust, Java, and now C# with Blazor. Blazor was created by Steve Sanderson about 2-ish years ago, a little bit longer than that. He was playing around. He's like, hey, .NET's open now. I've got all the code. Can I get it running in WebAssembly? Can I create C# in WebAssembly and have my client be C# instead of Java? It was announced last year from Microsoft that they're going to put some money and people behind it. They've been working on it a year, and this last May they announced as part of the 3.0 .NET 3.0 core release that it's part of that now, and it's into the preview. It's no longer an experimental language or experimental tool. And they did come out and say that from here going forward, they're going to support that. So it's going to be in .NET Core 5, which is the next version after 3, because they didn't want to get you confused with 4. And I know you have to have this big mind map of where all the versions of Microsoft.NET are. But and then from starting in 2020 in the fall, and every year after that, Microsoft said they're going to have a major release. So they'll do .NET Core 5 in fall of 2020, and then 2021 will be 6 and 7, and on and on and on. But Blazor will be a big part of that. Some of the requirements for currently, if you want to do the examples that I'm going to show today, you have to have the .NET Core 3 preview. You can use Visual Studio Preview, 2019 preview. You don't have to. I'll also show it in using Visual Studio Code. And then there's an extension. If you're using Visual Studio 2019, there's an extension that you can get to kind of give you the templates for that scaffolding. There's 2 different models that they have right now for Blazor. One is a complete client-side model, like you're running just JavaScript without a server. You can actually compile and build all this and put it out on a drive share, and it'll run from a drive share or from a S3 share or an an Azure storage location. Everything runs inside the browser, and it's confined. The other model, which is interesting, and they've been working on this one for a while, is you run completely server-side. It runs all .NET Core with the Blazor hooks, and then it sends the results to the client via SignalR. So it still gives you that appearance. Anymore, it's a subtle transition. A lot of people didn't notice, but your web pages don't flash anymore. And I had around 2000, I was doing web development, and my manager came to me and goes, I don't like how you click on a link and the page flashes. And I'm like, well, that's kind of how the web works. I'm going back to the server, getting data, and coming back. So with this, it's still doing that, but it's doing it through SignalR, and it's only replacing the elements in the DOM that you need to change out. And so it still appears like you're still on the same page or form, and it gives you more of that Windows or client side validation that you have. So let's look at some code. That's what we're here for. So I created, let me run it real quick. I created a, let me see it, whoop. .NET run. I may already have, let me see if I already, no. Yeah, I already have a version running. We'll see if I can just reload here. So I created an example, it's been about a year ago, of using Angular, and someone had, Patrick had created an example connecting to the Game of Thrones API, and did everything in Angular using the Game of Thrones API backend. Let me try to run that again. I'm just going to try to run that again. Let me come back to that one. That's what I do, try to play around with it right before the meeting. Yeah, all right, I'll come back to that. We can look at the code and I'll come back to that. So the other example, let me build up. So if you install the preview, if you install the extension, and this is the Visual Studio Preview version, you will have these templates. You'll go ahead and create a ASP.NET Core web app, and then when you go next, give it any name you want. It'll ask you for the model. And so you'll have, there's a couple of different ones. There's Blazor Serverside, and that's the one where it runs on the server side and then it serves up information via signal R back and forth. A core hosted one, which we'll talk about that builds out a back end, a shared library, and a front end. And so we'll take a look at that example, and then just the client side. So you have the client. One thing to notice is when I was looking at this, one of the changes that they did from the previous version is it was using CS HTML. It was using CS HTML, and now it's using actual Razor pages. So if you've ever done any .NET MVC using the Razor pages, it's going to be looking familiar. So I created a Blazor hosted version here. And it's the same example. If you've run, that's loading. If you've run any of the examples that Microsoft put out with a lot of these templates, it creates a couple of pages where you click on a page, we'll run that, click on a counter and it increases the counter. You can load data back and forth. But the interesting thing with this is it's all client side. So if I 12. Come on. It's loading up the page. And so what happens is it compiles everything and it actually publishes, and we'll take a look at that, what is sitting down. But you can click, and it's doing all this in the client. This actual call goes back to the server side that we have code and brings this back. If we pull up the dev tools, where are the dev tools? There we are. If we bring up the dev tools and go to network, and I reload that page, you'll be able to see, this is hard to see a little bit. I don't know if we can zoom in on this. Yeah, I can. So it actually downloads the CSS, style sheets, those type of things, but it also starts downloading this mono WASM. So this will change in probably one of the later releases. It's using the mono version of C#. So it compiles down to mono. There also is an announcement in May that they're kind of trying to bring together Xamarin and Mono and all the versions of .NET. So .NET 5, the vision is there's one .NET again, and we're bringing it all together. So it brings this down. Then you can also see it brought down the Blazor hosted client DLL. Okay, so it's actually bringing down that DLL, running this in the sandbox. So it brings down any code that I need. Also has mono security, mono JavaScript interop. You can actually do calls between Blazor and JavaScript if you still want to make calls back and forth. I added some annotations for the component model, so it brought that in. So you can see system core. It brings all of that down. So runs basically .NET in the browser. Let me hide this. If you look at the code, what's kind of behind that, the project that it created is it has a server side, and this is a typical server that you'd have before. This just has sample data, so it makes an API call, get to this controller, and it just returns some data from the server side. Also, but hosts those pages up. So in the pages side, it's going to load this index razor page, which is just, a page having the path here. So if you ever use razor pages, it's kind of combined all in one, where you have the page and the path. And I just messed that up, didn't I? So if you look at the counter, pretty simple code. It does for /counter for the route, and then you have your HTML, and then you have a on-click increment, calls this increment, and just increments that current count. Okay. So the razor pages versus like the CSHTML still had two different files. It had the CSHTML and the C# file. This kind of razor pages kind of combine that together, so you can run that together. And then if you look at like the fetch data, it's making a call. Here's just a table, loops through, prints out the data, but it's making a call. Quit left clicking here. Makes a call back to the back end, API/sample data/weather, and that was on this server side. So you can make a call, get that JSON, and then return that into this forecast object. And this forecast object, the nice thing about that is shared right here is a shared library that both the back end and front end can see. Okay. So a lot of talking there to get to the kind of the payoff for the first time in a long time. My models that I build work both on the back end and the front end, which is one of my complaints. Like I said, I'm kind of getting used to React and Angular and some things like that, but I'm having to rebuild my models in the UI and the back end if I want to do type checks and validation and those type of things. So that's one thing that's really nice is now I have that where I can build out my forecast. And the thing I added that's different from the out of the box is I added that the date is required. I added a range for the temperature has to be between -50 and 150. And I added a string length max of 50 characters for the summary. So you can add those validation things that you've probably done. If you're doing APIs in the back end for C# now or .NET Core or even .NET 4 something, you probably use this where you're saying, okay, I'm going to do some server-side validation, right? So if it comes back in, I can validate this, and if it's not valid, I can send back a message, these type of messages. It must be a certain length, it has to be this or that. But what you've had to do if you're using JavaScript, you've had to take that result and write your own validator, right? Show it on the screen, or you've had to have some type of client-side validation to kind of match the back-end validation. So I created a page. I added basically an add button that goes to this edit data razor. And so what the edit data razor page has, it has that I have data annotation validator and a validation summary where we'll show the errors. This is using edit form, so if you haven't used Razor Pages, it basically renders them out to inputs and buttons and those type of things, but it's just trying to help you do some validation and help it make it a little easier. So I have an input date, and I just bind it to the date value. I have a number and a text area. So I'm just binding that information together, and then when they click it, I'm just saying whether it's valid or not. I didn't submit it back to save. I don't have a database on the back end, but I'm just saying whether it's valid or not. So if I run this again, what'll happen here is all this validation will be done on the client, okay? In the past, we've had to go round trip back to the server, get the rules, and then come back. Now, it'll be done on the client. You still can, what's nice is you still can keep the server-side validation if someone else is calling your API directly and not going through your UI. So you'll still want your server-side validation, but now you have both. So if I come here and click this add button that I added to the edit, now if I hit submit, it's saying summaries required. If I enter 200 degrees, submit, must be 150, and it already was picking, since I did a date, it was picking the date. Let me do 150, and hello. I submit that, now it's gonna be, it's all valid, and I think if I pull up the developer tools again, I keep losing them. Developer tools again. On the console, it should say, if I click that again, yeah, this is valid. So I didn't, like I said, I didn't post back, but it'd be the same way that you'd posted to other back-end services. But now I know the client's definitely valid. It has valid input. Now I can move forward, post to the server with, at least from my UI, I know that I have good validation. And then anybody else calling my back-end APIs, I'm using the exact same rules, right? So to me, that was one of the big, nice things to have. Okay? So any questions on that so far? Feel free to interrupt or ask any questions. What's that? Where's it being validated? So those were using, the question was, where is it being validated in the code? So it's from these two attributes I just added to the form, okay? And I'm saying down here in the code, handle that validation, submit. So these two right here is part of the Razor Pages. The whole form has to be valid or it won't submit it. Yeah, so it'll actually render, you know, your input and put all the code into the page. So it doesn't, you're not, yeah, it's just an easy way. This, like I said, this is a summary. That's where those red bullets are saying, oh, you need a certain, you know, summary was required, or the temperature has to be this range. That's where that will print. And then this line here is actually validating the data in the form. And since I was using edit form, that's also a C# Razor syntax that you can use. You can use this today on the server side for Razor Pages. Now you can use it also in the client. Okay? So it reduces quite a bit of code, I think, on both front and back end for me. So let me try this again. Yes? I believe you can. So yes and no. The way that's written, so I can create a method, I can create a service, other class files, I can call any class files that I want. So you can still have these hooks here where I just have a hook and then call my code behind the scenes as a shared library or something like that. I'm not aware if you can break Razor Pages back into where it has just presentation and just a C# file. I'm not sure. Someone might know. I know you can with CS/HTML, so you can use either or CS/HTML or Razor for this. And so the CS/HTML is just HTML, and then your code behind that, and then also you can make calls to services. Yes, sir. currently does it all up front. The talk is that they're going to have it on demand in the future. But right, right, and that probably is one of the drawbacks right now, is it downloads everything. So, you know, however big your JavaScript files are, they're probably not that big. Whatever your DLLs are, if it has to download all the DLLs, it'll bring them all down. So anything you reference will automatically come down. But they're talked about two things to improve that. One, doing tree shaking on the open libraries. So if you, like system.core is an open library, so if you only use one call, it would recompile that down to a smaller, just that one call to include. So it doesn't include the whole system.core. That's not current, but that's a future desire of theirs. The other is the on-demand, is it only calls down the pages or DLLs that you need as you're loading, okay? But both of those are just talk right now, okay? So look at this page. We'll see if I can get this up. So one of the things I had done was, like I said, let's look at more of an example. So one of the, let me see if I can find that. Yeah, I have a service here, a Game of Thrones service. So if you go to api.got.show, there's an API for all the books and all the show information, so you can get information from all the different characters and do searches on that. So what do we typically do on some type of application? You have a list that you want to filter. And a lot of times in JavaScript, we'll get a large list and then we want to filter down that list. And we don't want to have to make calls back every time we type. So this example will download all of the characters, and then you can, in the client, type and it will narrow down the search without having to go back to the server. Okay. So the service itself, it only has two calls. One, it'll get the list of characters and then get a specific character. And it just passes, makes an HTTP client call to that URL endpoint and just returns that result. So I'm just taking that, the people method here. So there's a lot of different things I commented out. I didn't want to pull all this data, but basically I deleted a lot. I'm getting the name, the ID, the slug, which is a kind of a unique identifier, and then mentions, I don't really need that. But then they have a rank, which you can get your title and rank, you can get their age, and then here's all the different, you can have a list of titles. Like I said, I commented a lot of it out just so that my payloads aren't huge passing back and forth. So on that, get those, make those call back. So on the list, if I come down here, here's the code to get that. I'm creating a list of people, and I'm setting the search term to blank. I'm setting that kind of as a global search term. Making a call to the, when it initializes, so this call is the first call when the page loads, this on init async. It'll make that call when the page loads, and then it goes and calls that API in the back end, gets it, puts it into the people. And then this call is taking that list of people and filtering it on the search term. But where the search term is right here. I'm actually binding this input and saying I want to bind this value input to search term. Okay, so as people type, it's making calls and filtering that, right? I'm not going back, and then I'm looping through that filtered people instead of people. And then I'm printing out a card. Okay? And so what a lot of Razor has done is it has the concept of components, kind of similar to Angular, kind of similar to React, where you build components and then you comprise your UI of all these different components. And so Razor is very similar to that. I can create a people card, and then I just pass in the current person. So I don't have to write, I can use this anywhere in my app. So if I look at the people card, I think that's under shared. I created a people card that basically has a navigation link. If they click on that person, at all, it will take them to the detailed page, and then it's just listing out their name and what house they're from in that. And then what has with the card is you have a parameter. And so I'm setting the parameter of person, which was here, person, and it's taking whatever person in. So it takes this person in from this parameter and then runs this code up here. Yeah. So it's a nice way of being able to create reusable components, basically. So anywhere I have a reusable component. The detailed page is kind of the same thing. So I'm reading in a parameter of that slug, and that's taking it from the URL parameter. It's reading that in. And then I'm just going and getting that specific person, and then just listing out their name, what actor played them, what house they're from, and then it loops through a list of titles and prints out what titles they had. Several of the characters in Game of Thrones had a lot of titles. So let's see if we can debug that again. Let's do here. Just run it. I think it thinks I'm still running the server. Okay. Yep, still says you're already running the server, the instance. Does anyone know? Let's see, can I kill that? Task manager. No, sorry about this. I'll just end anything I find here. There you go. Try that again. Yes, no? Come on. It's time to upgrade the laptop. Little slow, little slow. Come on. Where's that? This right here? Yeah, that's a generic, so I don't have to do a callback. Well, let's see if it's running. Maybe it didn't load the browser and it's actually working. Okay, and it says, okay, it's not secure, I know, because it's on my machine. There we go. So just go to this route. It loads, goes out and calls and gets all the people. It'll take a second because there's quite a few. Loads here, now I can do searches, and it doesn't go back to the server. So, no. I've drawn blank on characters. A lot of these people I don't even know anymore. Tyrion. Yeah. So we can load a character, and it'll show what they are. When I go back, went back. So it's not caching it, but you could. You could store this in the client. So you could store this right now, it loads every time we go to this page, but you would probably go ahead and load it once, go to the detail, and if you come back, say, don't go back and reload it if I already have everybody. Here's an example of someone who had a lot of titles. So, little different. This one was done with Visual Studio Code, and it's only the client version. If you look at the kind of the structure of that, it built out. Close some of the pages here. it builds out. I added the models, so I wanted the people model for myself, and I built the services and the shared. And what happens, it compiles and it puts out, you can build this and put it out, it'll output into this www root. So on the client side, you can package this up and then copy that out to a server, just completely on the client, and it'll just run on a drive share, right? So you don't need a server, and space and storage space is cheap. So that's one of the things you can do with both S3 and Amazon, or Azure both lets you do that. Let's see here. One of the other things I thought was interesting. Oh, well, we can do, let me pull up a git bash. So you can do .NET new, and if you don't specify, it'll list all of these out. Let me do that again. It'll list all the templates that you have. You may not have all of these. If you don't have them, you can go out to, there's a GitHub location for all the templates, and you can download whatever templates you want. But one of the new ones was this Blazor. So I can do, and you can do this in two. I think 2.1 and 2.2 have it, but it's a little different from the version 3. So .NET new Blazor. And that'll create everything for me. And then if I do a new window and go to that test, it's actually, I think it's going to be in my users, Jeff, test. Yeah. Oh, well, here in the, okay. Code dot for current location. Yeah, there you go. I'm too used on my Mac where I don't have that mapped. Yeah, so it's the same kind of thing. This one, actually the weather data is local, so you're making calls to client weather data instead of doing the back end. Your pages, same thing. It has that counter page, the fetch data, and the index page. WW roots where the output goes. Some of your imports, you can actually put this where you want to import your C# libraries, so you can call them here instead of having to do it after each class. So it'll bring those in. So this is basically what's going to get published. So from time to time, if you're just adding a bunch of stuff, you may want to come back in here and clean this up. Because I've done some projects where I'm like, yeah, add that, and I never use it. And then they get added into this file, and it gets pretty unwieldy. As far as the way it starts up, the program, it's not that different. It does read from the configuration and use Web Builder Startup. And then on the actual startup, the magic for this is map Blazor Hub call. So it's mapping and getting all the routing for your Blazor tools and calls right there. So everything else that I've found has been very similar if you're building just an ASP.NET MVC Razor site. I kind of still want to take one and build just an MVC Razor and Blazor and see kind of how they do compare, but they're very, very similar. Okay? Is there any other questions? So that's all I had. Nope. Who's going to use this when it gets released? Maybe? Maybe? I want to. It's convincing the management now, right? Okay. Well, thanks.